A long time ago, when I went knocking on doors for my first job, I was hired at a leadership consulting firm because they wanted a clinician to work with leaders. Because the reality about leadership is we learn everything about leadership, like vision casting, being a change agent, engaging talent, building critical mass, all of those great leadership things. But then something happens. We have to go out there and do it. And you step into that space where Bill talked about on the first day, where you're going from here to there. And you know what? It's you that's on that path. And we have all this knowledge, and we need the knowledge, but ultimately, you get out there, and it's you that has to do it. And that's when I fell in love with the field of leadership and sitting there listening to CEOs and executive team members listen to this middle space of everything they learn about leadership and their personal struggles and their personal aspirations, and many times what Bill talked about, the necessity to find the courage when things get bigger. And I fell in love with leadership, and I fell in love with leaders. And so that's what I've been doing pretty much for 3 decades now, is working with leaders in all sorts of contexts, from big companies to family-held companies to small companies to Christian organizations. And here's why I love it, because as leaders, you are people that take charge. And you do stuff. Like Bob Goff said, you get out there and you do stuff. I was talking to a CEO one day, and he said, you know, I got this problem with my culture, and he explained the problem with culture, and I said, why is that? And he said, well, I got this problem with, you know, the thing about the culture is this one team, and it's like this. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, I hired this guy from this other company, and he brought in these ways from there. I said, why is it? And I kept saying, why is that? Why is that? Why is that? And finally he looks at me and he goes, well, I guess I am ridiculously in charge, huh? And see, that's why I like leaders. Because leaders don't blame. Leaders take the stewardship that God has given them for whatever they are supposed to be stewards over, and they exert their energy of their heart, mind, soul, and strength in that space to lead people. And they take ownership of that. You know, leaders do some hard things and take charge of cultures and problems, difficult people problems. What I'm about to tell you is a true story. A man who started a company, got to be a big company, built a big company, was getting near retirement. His oldest son was going to be the heir apparent. And he was in a succession plan with him 2 or 3 years before he retired. He had been training him. He walks onto the factory floor one day, and he sees his son angrily berating an employee in front of another group of employees. He motions to his son like that to come up to his office. He goes up and he sits him down. He says, David, I wear 2 hats around here. I wear the boss hat, and I wear the father hat. I'm the boss, and I'm your father. Right now, I'm going to put my boss hat on. You're fired. I will not have that in my culture. I will not have that in the DNA of the company that I've built. I will not have my employees treated that way. I won't have them diminished. I've told you about this. We tried to get you help. You won't listen. We've done this over and over. And so you're done. You're fired. Now I'm going to put my father hat on for a second. Son, I heard you just lost your job. Can I help you? Can you imagine, talk about courage, Bill, can you imagine the dinner conversation at home that night? I'm a shrink. With a son like that, there's always an enabling mother somewhere in the picture. He's got to go home and talk about this. I know, I'm going to get angry emails about that one. Sometimes it's the dad. But leaders do hard things and they take charge. But what I want to share with you for a few minutes here today is the hardest thing that a leader has to be ridiculously in charge of, and that is him or herself. Him or herself. You know, when you look at leaders, and they do a lot of different things, but basically they kind of all do the same things. The first thing they do is envision a future, a desired result. They have a vision. And then they engage talent to go do that. And then they have some sort of execution of a plan. And then they measure that and hold people accountable, and they tweak what they find. And everybody does that who's a leader. They go from here to here. But some of them get results, and some of them don't. And many times, and this is where we're going to focus today, many times those who start to get results and then they do something in here somewhere is they start a downward spiral that they can't stop because it becomes very difficult to be in charge of themselves. So what I want to share with you this morning is a little bit of the leadership psychology, what the research says and what experience shows, and I will just, share with you something we have all felt about how a downward spiral of a leader happens, and very accomplished leaders. And what I'm going to promise you is, how many of you have ever experienced yourself hit some difficult circumstance and start to spiral down in how you think or feel or behave? How many of you have experienced that? Okay? Look at the person next to you on your team. Hands back up. If their hand is not up, tell them there's a denial seminar going on down the street. Because like Bill said, he talked about when he had been there, everybody gets there. And if you're not there yet, you know why? Because you just got to keep succeeding, because then it'll get big enough where it'll blow your circuits. Because it's going to happen. So we're going to look at what happens in this downward spiral. Why does this occur? Well, the truth is that leaders who continue and stop a spiral, who have charge of themselves, they're in charge of themselves, and they can continue in hard times, here's what we know. They think, feel, and behave differently than the ones who spiral out. And we're going to unpack that for a minute. A number of years ago, where some of this was discovered, there was a study done, and it was in the insurance industry. And what they did was they took two groups of people. They took a group of people that had applied to get hired by the insurance company. It was a big company. I think it was MetLife. And they took this one group and they just blew out the test. They just scored really high on the test, the aptitude test for the industry, and they hired all those guys. Then they took another group of people that had flunked the aptitude test to get hired in the industry. Dummies. And you know what they did for the experiment? They hired them. Now, here's the hard question. If I gave you a prize to put a team together, which group do you want as a leader? Which team do you want? You want the smart guys or you want the idiots? Hard questions come later. Okay? So here's what happens. They sent them out into the field, and the dummies blew them away. Are you ready for this? 53% difference in sales. 53%. Turn to that person that came with you. Now I'm glad you're on my team. 53% different. Now here's the one thing I didn't tell you, and this gets to the spiraling leader. There was one other difference. The smart guys, they gave another test to measure their thinking and their feeling and their behaving in terms of, were they positive or negative? Were they prone to spiraling in their thinking, or were they able to have charge of themselves where they don't do that? And guess what? In the smart group, they put the smart guys who were pessimists, and they put the flunkers who were optimists, and the ones that had control of their thinking and thought positively, 53% better results. So here's the moral of the story. If you got a choice between those who can and they don't think they can, and those who can't but they believe they can, the ones that believe they can will win every single time. Every single time. And here's what we know about results and this vision. All of the research on goals will come together and basically say this, that the biggest factor that loads on whether you will get from here to there and take your organization from here to there is, number one, whether or not you believe that it can be done. The number one factor. And there's a lot of derivatives of that, of sustaining hope in it and facing reality and priorities and a bunch of stuff. But the number one factor is, do you believe that it can happen? And here's what we're going to look at. All leaders believe that it can happen when they start. But then something happens. They get into a circumstance, and it will happen to you, a circumstance somewhere where they become out of control, or they realize that they're out of control, I should say. And what I mean by that is not of themselves, exactly the opposite. They are out of control of the circumstances around them, and that begins to change their brain. It's a condition called learned helplessness. And it goes like this. You know, you were designed by God to be in a cause and effect universe. You do A, B happens. You preach, the place fills up, right? You give a message, people donate money. You create a product, take it to market, make sales calls, they buy it. You do this as a leader, you get results. Until you find yourself in a circumstance where there are things that you cannot control that are affecting you. Let me give you some examples. You had do we have the poll results up there from earlier? Do we not have the poll results? Okay. You took a poll, and here's what a bunch of you said. I'm going to try to remember the numbers. It was something like 40-something% of you said right now that 40-something% of you that you are being stressed by things that you cannot control above you, like your boss, the parent company, the board of elders, all the ones above you. There's nothing you can do, and it's affecting you. Another big chunk of you said that it had to do with the market conditions that you were in, trying to minister in a certain place, trying to be, I do a lot of work with healthcare companies. Right now, in the transition of healthcare and that whole environment, things they can't control, it's just really, really hard in this circumstance. And then the third group of you said it had to do with the people that you actually, your constituents that you work with, your customers or your congregation members. But see, the point is, everybody feels this. Now, what happens to the brain when you find yourself in a situation that you can't control? A crazy board of elders, a crazy CEO, a crazy parent company, or anything else above you, or crazy market conditions, the brain begins to change in some predictable ways that we're going to unpack here. When Bill called me and asked me to speak here this week, he said, please come tell them about the 3 Ps. And this is what I want you to go away with today. The brain begins to change when you are out of control of circumstances that are affecting you. The brain begins to change in the ways that it interprets everything around you. And they're called the 3 Ps. What happens is you go do something, an A to get a B result. You go try to do a sales call and it doesn't happen. They don't buy. Or you preach a sermon and nobody really comes forward. Or you go talk to a donor. Or you go do a presentation. The customer doesn't do the deal. And the first thing that happens is the brain begins to interpret that in a personal way. Why didn't that sale happen? Well, because I'm no good. I'm just not, what made me think I could do this? Or you go do a capital campaign. What made me think I could raise money to build a building like they have at Willow? Of course, if you do think that, you're an outlier anyway. That was a sort of a, this is a big building. But you start to interpret it in some way, I'm not good enough. And you know what the reality is? Every leader does stuff that doesn't work when they're getting from here to there. But the dummies, don't let it bother them. Because they don't take it personally. They go hit up that donor or try to make that sale deal or whatever it is, and it doesn't happen. And they don't take it personally. They go, well, I guess they weren't ready, or I could tweak the presentation, or they didn't want to do it, or I got to keep looking. But it's not because I'm not good enough. But what happens is you get in a circumstance where the world is changing around you and you can't have control of results and your brain begins to change. Sometimes this happens in childhood. A child grows up and they're trying to, be a kid, and they're trying to, they want mom or dad to love them or approve of them. Nothing they do can get that result. They're out of control of that. And deep in their soul, they begin to feel, it's me. And then when they go to that board of elders and they do that presentation or that executive team or whatever it is, and it doesn't go well that day, it cements that belief. And then the brain begins to shut down. And then it goes to the next P. Pervasive. You know what? It's not just that one customer, it's all my customers. It's not just that one elder. Everybody, nobody really thinks I'm any good around here. And it's not just, it's not just the business. It's not just that client. It's all my clients. In fact, it's the whole industry. You know what? My whole life sucks. And it just goes subjective because it's gone into a different region of the brain that goes global, and everything becomes bad. And at that point, the spiral is beginning to happen. And then there's another event. You get an email that's critical, as we heard earlier. And what does it do? It just reinforces these, and then the kiss of death sets in, and that's when it goes to the third P. It's permanent. It'll always be this way. It's not going to change. And once the brain begins to go into this state and the software changes, I'm going to tell you, even the best performers can get there and begin to spiral. But here's what we're going to learn now. There's a way out. There's a way out. And as Carly was saying, science and the Bible always agree in a place called reality. If they're not agreeing, you got goofy science or wacky Christians, and there's no shortage of either. So here's what the science says. That this can be turned around, but also it can happen to the best. We see David in the Bible going here, struggling. We see everybody going here. We see great leaders. About the middle of 2008, when the economy really was starting to show this is not a little blip. I was doing a lot of work on Wall Street, and the CEO of one of the big Wall Street firms that you would recognize was my client. And it was in the middle of the downturn, or the beginning of the middle of the downturn. And if you remember at the end of 2008, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, it all just started to crash, right? And it affected every industry. Pretty much every industry I was working in was feeling the same thing. And this CEO, who's a wonderful, great Christian leader, we were sitting in his office in Manhattan, late in the fall, winter morning. He hands me a letter from an angry client to one of his brokers, one of his financial advisors. He had 10,000 of them out there. And he said, this is what my men and women are getting every day. And it was written, you are all crooks. You should go to prison. You've stolen my life. And he said, this is what they're getting. He said, my men and women out there, he said, they give their lives for their clients. They live for them. They're not trying to hurt them, but these poor people have lost half of their life savings and their kids' college fund and their retirement. Of course they're upset, but they're taking it out on my people. I've got to help them. He said, what can you do? I said, well, I think we can do a lot. And he said, but I'm also interested in that client because that client's had his or her life flash before their eyes. And I think what I can help you do is learn how the brokers can enter into that space of the client and transform that as well. But let's go figure it out. So we put together his highest performers in 20 markets, and I flew around the country, and I did half day of focus groups with his highest performers. And I'm telling you, these are high performers, like Barron's top 50 type people. And here's what I heard. These are people that really had gotten there. One man said, I've been in this industry for 30 years. I've never lacked confidence. I go into the office, I sit, and then I wake up. I've been staring at my computer for an hour and haven't done anything. Another one said, I can't pick up the phone. I can't make a phone call. Another one said, I wake up at 3:37 every morning. The lady next to him said, mine's 2:42. The one on the other side of the table said, mine's 3:18. And they were all beginning to spiral. And they talked about the drive that they couldn't do anymore. Why? Because their brains were changing. What learned helplessness is about, the way they discovered this, they had dogs and they would shock them. This was before PETA got in charge of the earth. They would shock them, and then the dogs could hit a lever and the shock would stop. And then they started shocking them, and they hit the lever and they wouldn't stop the shock. And you know what happened? The dogs gave up. Their brains shut down. They got depressed. And then they made it so the dog actually could get out, but after their brains had changed, it wasn't working anymore, even when they could get out. And that's what happens to leaders. When your brain begins to do this and everything's going negative, the things that you can do that can change things, you just don't do them anymore. So what we did was we started to go after the 3 Ps in a scientifically researched way, but one that the Bible says is the way that God designed the brain to work. And the first thing was we have to reverse the 3 Ps. So here's what we did. I got them to begin to, I'm going to give you the plan out. It's in the book, Boundaries for Leaders. It's a whole plan in there. But the first thing was this. I got them to log them and what the scientists call dispute them. I wanted them to actually write down the negative thoughts. And they said, we're not going to do it. I said, do it. You're not going to believe it. One guy said that he actually, before all of his calls, he wrote down the stuff that he thought the customer or the client was going to say to him. This is in his head. They were going to be mad. Why did you do this? All this kind of stuff. He wrote down all this. Basically, we calculated it. 99% of what was in his head in the 3 Ps was absolutely false. 99%. And then we started to find the themes in there, and he started to dispute them. And what this means is this negative stuff that's in your head, where it says, you're not good enough, you dispute it. If you're a person of faith, you dispute it with God's word that says absolutely this. What do you mean you're not good enough? You are my workmanship, he says. And I created you with that gift of leadership to put you right where you are. And you dispute it every time it comes into your head, because I'm going to tell you something. As science has found, there's a difference between your brain and your mind. Your brain is a physiological organ that can be subject to goofy chemicals that send off false alarms like you're stupid. It has nothing to do with reality. Nothing to do with reality. And you dispute it and you say, that's absolutely wrong. And you write down the reasons it's wrong. If you're a person of faith, you put your Bible verses there. If you're not a person of faith, you know what? God made you as well. And you are where you are because he gave you gifts. So you better tell the noise to shut up, that somebody put you there with those gifts and they're real. And then the second thing is this. What caused this whole problem? What caused this whole problem? It's the loss of control. And you got to dispute the personal stuff. You got to dispute the pervasive stuff. You know, you think everything's bad. No, write it down. Everything's not bad. That client is mad at you, but another one loves you. This one is going south, but another one's not. Your family's doing well, or your marriage or something. And I had people looking at their lives and getting a whole list, and where they found out it's not pervasive. Sorry, I turned the wrong one there. It's not pervasive at all. Some of it's bad, but it's not. I want you to get very objective about this, because when you begin to look at the whole picture, life changes. Your life is a movie, it's not a scene. And the story of the Bible and the story of everyone's life is every great movie has crisis scenes in it. And when you go from here to there, it's the brains that see it as a scene and start doing the behaviors that end a good movie that win. And then it's not permanent, because the Bible says there's a hope for you, that God has created a long path for you. And the best predictor of the future is past behavior. And his behavior in the past is pretty good. He's parted seas. He's brought us out of darkness. And then I want you to do this in your teams. Begin to talk about and dispute this crazy stuff and log it and write it down and come together to do that. And then number 2 is, remember what caused this? It was the control. So we're going to do something to get back in control. We're going to do something to get back in control. What I want you to do is I want you to have 2 columns: what you can't control and what you can control. You can't control the economy. You can't control the board of elders. You can't control your crazy boss. Turn to him right now and say, okay, I'm not going to try anymore. You can't control a lot of stuff, and I want you to write it down and get together and worry about it, obsess about it as hard as you can for about 5 minutes. And then I want you to go over here and I want you to write down the stuff you can control. What I found was the people that were thriving, this is what they did. Every day they had a list of the things that they absolutely could do, the behaviors. They could call their clients. They could check up on them. They could give a perspective. They could show up with hope. They could do a plan. They could explain the bigger picture. They could do client meetings. There were a bunch of things that they could do. If you're a pastor, it doesn't matter how crazy it is out there, all the way down throughout the organization, down to the teams that welcome people. They have control of the way the place feels. When somebody walks in, they can smile. I fly a particular airline that's going through a reorg. I interviewed 100 flight attendants. Never got one positive answer about how the reorg is going. And I talked to the other passengers that I fly with a lot, and we all talk about, it's like they don't want us to be here. It's like they hate us. Somewhere, and when I talk to them, it's all about the unions, it's about the reorg and all this. Why doesn't somebody tell them they could smile? Then we might keep flying your airline and bring our friends, and then the numbers would change, and the union guys would be happy. Everybody has control of something. You can call a donor. You can do leadership development. There's always something that you can do, and that's how you get from here to there when the brain is working and it's firing, because you're disputing the negative noise. You're getting back in control of what you can do, and you're beginning to do those behaviors. And I had them, some of them, write them down to very specifics of every day. This is what I can control today, and this is what I'm going to do. In Matthew 6:30-something, Jesus said, don't worry about tomorrow. Every day has its own problems. Get that list. Take control of what you can control of and drive it home. Sometimes you'll find it's an easier day. You can just look out the window in the rose garden and watch squirrels eating nuts. It's not as bad as you think it is. And then the last thing is, your brain turns into a cesspool in negative circumstances if it's allowed. Your brain will turn into a cesspool of stress if your focus is on things you can't control. But your brain also needs fuel. And your brain runs on 3 things: oxygen, glucose, and relationship. And the third thing you've got to do in your companies, with your people, is you must connect. You know, we were talking about shame earlier, and the answer to bad and feeling bad is never doing good. It will not work. The opposite of bad is not good. The opposite of bad is love. In the Bible, when we became ashamed, it's because we lost a relationship with God and with each other. And we took the fig leaf and we covered ourselves up. And we felt bad. And we started trying to do good so we would feel better. And the opposite of bad is not good. The opposite of bad is relationship. Because once you feel good in relationship about the fact that you are connected, your brain changes and you forget about whether you're good or bad, and you start to go solve problems. And that's what teams do that come together. One of the things we found, and I took 10,000 brokers through this, is we put them together, flew 500 branch managers in, trained them in this program. They went back and did small groups in their branches of stockbrokers. And they put them together, and they started to have weekly structured meetings connecting with each other. But connecting not around the water cooler talking about sports, but connecting, talking about the battle itself and how they were feeling and how they could help each other and solving problems and what it was doing to them and sharing. And when they connected, the brain changes. One of my favorite studies is about monkeys where again, before PETA got in control of the earth, they took monkeys and stuck them in cages and freaked them out. Loud noises, cymbals, flashing lights, and the monkeys are like, and their eyes are this big, and they're just frozen in terror. And then they do one thing, and all the researchers they did one thing. They didn't change the flashing lights and the stressors and the noise. No new board of elders, no, market conditions different. The stressors were the same. They did one thing. They opened the door to the cage, and they put the monkey's buddy in the cage. They closed the door, and they retested the stress level. Just by putting the monkey's buddy in the cage, in the bloodstream, we have ways of testing this with cortisol and other chemicals. The stress level, when the monkey's buddy was put in the cage, the stress level drops by 50%. Connect, connect, connect. When you're going from here to there and you feel the spiral starting, connect and your brain will change. And what started happening was the CEO was bombed with letters from spouses. Thank you for giving me my husband or wife back. He used to be checked out. And people started, it was just amazing. And why? Because God tells us this. Jesus, the first thing he did with his army, of his team, was he put them in the upper room and he said, he prayed to God to make them one as he was one with his Father. And he sent them out with their own gifts to get in control of what they could be in control of. And then he taught them what to believe. And I'll close with this. A can-do attitude is something that will give you confidence, even in people that you love. My oldest daughter, our oldest daughter, Olivia, who is 12 now. A couple of years ago, our brother-in-law, who was a Navy SEAL, was killed in Iraq. And they started a paddle out he was a surfer, and they started a paddle out as a memorial on the 4th of July, and all the big people would go out and paddle out and have a memorial to mark. And Olivia wanted to paddle out with the big people. And I said, Olivia, and so she talks me into it. So she goes out there to do this. She's 12 years old, out in the waves and all this. She comes back, and I'm so proud of her because she's done this thing, and she's also honored her Uncle Mark. And I said, I'm so proud of you. And she said, Daddy, I want to go back out there. The big people are going back out in the ocean. I said, you can't go back out there. No, you can't. And she said, yes, I want to. I said, no, you can't. Because I was afraid for her to do it. And then I played my trump card. Besides, you can't carry your surfboard back. I got to go, and you'd be all by yourself. It's a long way up the hill. You can't do it. And I thought I'd won, but I forgot who I was dealing with. She turns to me and she says, Dad, I'll find a way. At that moment, the psychologist and the Father and me came together, and I cried because I knew I don't have to worry about that girl's downward spiral, because in her heart and soul is a find a way thinking. That's what God wants for you. It's what he wants for your people. And may God empower you and bless you to get there.